Actually, although I'm a psychologist, I do work and publish in geography journals, and was director of the Centre for Environmental Risk at University of East Anglia, where the large environmental school is, which has done a lot of work on climate change and risk issues. So I see myself as an interdisciplinary researcher. I was asked today to come and talk, really just, I suppose, talk conceptually first, to just set off some thoughts about what risk is and why and how it is handled in policy in particular. So I'll touch on a couple of case studies, but maybe not all of the ones that the other speakers will talk about. So I'd like to do three things. And it's a very large topic, I would say, so in 10 minutes and questions it's going to be difficult to say too much about this. So how do we define risk? How is that being thought of in formal mathematical and other theory, which is not very difficult, but needs thinking through first. And what I will say is there are all sorts of difficulties in defining risk, and I think that will come up throughout the evening. Then I would say a little bit, because I'm a psychologist stroke geographer, some of the social processes which arise when a risk crisis turns up, and I'll refer to one or two things, but in particular show a bit of information from the Clara crisis, which has occurred over the last 6 to 9 months in the UK. And then just a few closing remarks again on the issue of risk communication. Now, Tom said, and I'll also talk a little bit about climate change, because as Tom said, that's one of the things that I've had most interest in, alongside a number of other technological controversies as well around the environment. But climate change has been something I've been studying over the last few years. So just to show this slide, if you think about it, Britain has seen a fair share of environmental risk controversies over the last few years. In fact, there was a turning point, was the mad cow crisis in the late 90s. And that really actually changed government policy fundamentally. It changed the way we think about science and society. The recommendations of particularly the House of Lords report on that crisis were that scientists had been too reticent in interacting with the public and stakeholders, and there needed to be a changed terms of reference, as they put it, between science and society. To some extent that has happened, not entirely. We've seen the big foot and mouth crisis about 10 years ago, and more recently tree disease. We've got debates about the energy system going on, many of which are conflicted and set to continue, and many of which had a geographical, local aspect to them, which becomes very, very different from the sort of the national attitudes that people hold. And then climate change and the questions about and what's happening around that, how will it affect us as individuals sitting here or other parts of the globe, and how we might deal with that. So just a bit of kind of background. Formal risk has two principal definitions. It can be talked about, risk can be talked about as likelihood of harm. So we judge something as risky based on its chance of occurrence, and it has some negative consequence. But I don't think that really captures what we mean, because if you look at the interesting experiment in Exhibition Road out there, this is kind of shared space now between cars and pedestrians. There is a certain risk attached to crossing that road, but actually the probability on any single crossing or a visit to the museums or RGS is very, very low. But you might still think it's risky, so you have to take into account the fact you could die. So it's to do with the measure of consequence as well, which in that case potentially is very high. So the second definition is the one that's often used. So it's some combination of consequence and likelihood. So there is a National Risk Register. I was asked to just say something about this. It has basically, those are the two dimensions. That's likelihood, very unlikely through to very likely. Fortunately, there's nothing there. And then consequence, and that is a rough scale from 1 to 5, which takes into account the number of deaths that might be expected, plus economic losses, plus other societal disruption. Just to show you let's just see if this will work. Yes. So something that's seen as not particularly prioritised by government would be that's animal disease which can't pass across to humans. Relatively likely to turn up, but it's not seen as having huge consequences in terms of deaths. Major industrial accidents, on the other hand, a lot of work goes into that. Now, they're certainly very unlikely, but on the past record, a major accident, think of the Piper Alpha fire, let's say offshore, 30 years ago, would killed about 200 people. So it's maybe a range between a small number of deaths and quite a large number of deaths. So that's seen, the consequence is seen as high. And then the thing that actually the government has prioritised, really worries about is this last one, which is pandemic influenza, because they believe actually the likelihood of it's quite high in relation to all of those other hazards, and actually if it does break out globally, then it would have huge, and it's killing younger people, that it would have huge consequences for the country across a whole range of things. I should ask, does anybody know what's missing from this? There are two things that are missing. Can anybody think what they are? And they're not, neither of them are anything to do with the countryside, I should add, but can anybody suggest? Very good, terrorism, and there's one other thing that's missing. No, it's not a specific thing, actually. I'm probably... No. It's things we can't think of. No, it's not actually... There are sort of climate changey things there, so drought and flooding. No, terrorism is not on there, and there's a separate register for terrorism, simply because nobody knows how to calculate that for terrorism. And that makes the point that there's uncertainty. So nobody can work out what the probability of a terrorist event in London or in some other location is. And that's always been the case, and an observation about this. And that says that there's uncertainty attached to. Immediately, it's a problem with doing a risk assessment if you can't work out what the likelihoods are, even though it's a significant event. And then the other thing is this is bounded by our imagination, so there may be something out there, it's a so-called black swan event, which we've not thought of, and Clara, ash tree, ash dieback was not on this list. We're nowhere near this list a year ago, and now it's being considered to go on that list because they've just not thought about it. So that's an interesting thing. So risk assessments are always only partial. That's how we deal with climate change, and that's from the Stern report from a few years ago. And all you see there is risk is evaluated through proxies. So you have here, these are the sort of consequences, and then as global temperature goes up, there's an increasing chance of one of those issues coming to pass in a serious way. The second point about risk, though, is science cannot tell you what is acceptable risk. And what we've got here is the warming that's already in the system, the acceptable risk, or the risk that we want to avoid as a result of current international agreements is 2 degrees C. But that, to some extent, that's an arbitrary cutoff, because in fact, if you are in the coral reefs, or you're in a small island that's very low-lying in the Pacific, then actually 2 degrees is too much. That's unacceptable. So there's a value judgment involved in acceptable risk and risk assessment as well. And I'm sure we'll come back to that in the discussion. Responses to uncertainty, what do we do? And I'll just mention one of these, one of them is to be flexible. So if you can't actually work out the probabilities or the consequences, then your decisions have to be quite flexible, or you try to assess the uncertainty, or you build in what's called system resilience. Again, a good example of that is the flood protection. It's been realized that rising sea levels only by a small amount and rising storm frequency will potentially impact upon the flood barrier in a certain number of years within the next 80 years or so. So a risk assessment has been done. They're not quite sure what it means, other than at some point new flood protection has to be put in. So the flexibility they built in and said, well, we'll wait and see for a short period of time, 30 years or so, to see how climate change is actually impacting this part of the globe and this part of the world. And then we'll make the decision. We'll start working out what the options are and how much money we have to invest to renew that system. So they built instead of going down one solution now and spending lots of money, they're remaining flexible at this stage. Okay. I'll say a bit about ash dieback, social consequences of risks. Very interesting, something I study, and that's a good example. As I said, it was not on the risk register, and now they're thinking about putting it there. But it's interesting why it became an issue. And this is something we call social amplification of risk, that sometimes risk issues which were sort of there in the background, and in a sense the risk itself has not changed, and often the risk itself is very difficult to measure, as I've suggested, that there are actually uncertainties attached to this. And there are actually two possibilities for ash dieback coming into this country. We've known it's been coming across the continent for about 10 years. It's kind of reached the channel, and then possibly some spores have blown over, or just on the wind, or it's been due to changed farming, changed industrial practices in the tree sector. So basically, import of contaminated plants. We're not quite sure what has caused that. But look at this was all the reporting from November when it first really became a story, and it's really quite strong language, if you think about it. And there's an interesting question as to why the reporting and the response. Thousands of people then called the Forestry Commission helpline, became active citizens in thinking about ash dieback issues locally. And it's more than just a bunch of trees at stake here, I think, important though those are. The economic impact of the trees per se, certainly of the whole tree stock in the UK, is about 2 billion or something like that. And I think the social value of forestry is 9 billion. Those are big figures, but they don't fully explain why people have had this reaction. And a few years ago, we did some work on public responses to forestry, the meaning of woods and trees to people. And what we discovered was trees, if they were to go, take away a part of our identity, so that they, particularly in rural areas, but not only in rural areas, people in cities as well see trees as part of British identity. So you think about the oak as the classic English tree, and if the oak were to go completely, then the English would be less for that, or the British would be less for that event. So that's one of the reasons why Clara has been a huge impact in terms of the media, and then the political response follows on. Another one, I mean, the media, it's interesting. Clara doesn't really have pictures like this, but Fukushima was very much reported in very, very graphic images, and some really interesting images were used for those of us who study media reporting of this. And that all ends up, you have a very, I won't explain this in detail, a very complicated process where risk signals are then picked up by amplifiers in society. Well, the media is one, but there are others as well, and that then leads to other consequences. So things, in a sense, become crises as a result of interactions between many institutions involved. And a good example of this, what then happens is you get something that my colleague Paul Slovic in America talks about, a ripple effect, and Roger Casperson, who's a geographer in America, that actually the initial risk then leads to a consequence that's not actually related to the initial issue. So a good example is foot and mouth crisis in 2002. We were all told this was terrible, which it was awful for the farmers, don't visit the countryside. What then happened was a collapse in tourism for about 6 months or so, and huge losses to the tourist economy. So there was a secondary impact of the risk reporting and the risk issue. And whether that was good or bad advice, nevertheless there was that secondary consequence. I'll finish on this. I'll just say that a lot of work has been done on risk communication and guidelines, just to say that I think this is the most important point. Well, 2 points actually. Design communications as dialogue. So we now talk about talking to stakeholders, talking to the public, members of the public like yourselves and others, as a dialogue, not a one-way provision of information. And that was one of the key outcomes, I think, of the BSE inquiry I mentioned right at the start. And then finally, if possible, use trusted sources on risk communication. Unfortunately, we look at this last one. This was some data we collected just briefly during the foot and mouth crisis, actually at its height. And unfortunately, the media, I hate to say it, Tom, but you're down the bottom. So this is from low trust to high trust, various institutions, media down there, ministers even worse. The Ministry of Agriculture was pretty bad. Who was trusted? Interesting, the veterinary surgeons, which is not such a bad thing, but it's interesting that people also trusted the farmers and friends and family. With consumer organisations. The Food Standards Agency, who'd just been set up at that time, were quite pleased with this result because it said something to them about their public profile. We may talk more about trust as we go along. I think that's my 12 minutes. Thank you.
One of the things that struck me as interesting, and you didn't mention, was where there are risks and potential benefits. This strikes me, it comes up a lot in the wind turbine debate, that the risk, in inverted commas, may be immediate and apparent to you because it's near your house or it's in your view or whatever it is that you object to, and yet the benefit may be something rather more undefinable, like saving the planet. Although I suppose that is quite definable. But and another one, I think GM is interesting in this sense, because although the risk, according to a lot of scientists, is very, very small, or possibly not even there, for the public, they say, well, what's the benefit for me? So, I'm just wondering how you factor in your discussions about how public react, how you factor in benefits alongside risks.
You're absolutely right, and the whole discussion of acceptable risk, which I touched on very early on, also factors in benefit as well. So one would run a higher risk if there's a very, very major benefit, yes. And there's a good example as well that those of you who still fly nowadays in the climate-constrained world, if you fly to Schiphol Airport, it could not be built now, I think, because there are too many flight movements over too much population, and it actually fails the risk assessments, just about.
For the inhabitants of Amsterdam or for the people in the plane?
Well, no, for the inhabitants of Amsterdam. Okay.
Right.
And that's not to worry anybody flying to Schiphol, but...
but you wouldn't buy a house there, is that what you're saying?
I wouldn't buy a house there now. But that's because a decision has been taken that A, it's there, and B, the benefit is so large to the Dutch economy that risk criteria can be slightly relaxed. Another example is actually the armed forces runs huge risks, and the argument is, of course, that anybody else in an occupational setting would not be allowed to run. But because of their particular occupational setting, obviously the health and safety executive can't go into the argument and say close that down because that's too risky. So benefit is always taken into account, and the other point that comes out of that is that the risk and benefit balance is often different depending on the sector. That was on one of my slides. And historically, animal protection, tree protection, climate policy, health and safety at work, radiation protection, all have rather different ways of measuring risk and measuring benefit. And that often causes a lot of confusion actually in policy because you've got different bits of government doing slightly different things. So, but benefits are huge part of this, yes.
Just the other thing I wanted to view on is it sometimes seems to me when we look at this that an unknown fear is more potent than a quantifiable risk.
Yes.
You could argue that this might be the case with why a lot of people find nuclear energy so troubling, quite apart from the cost problems and all those which we'll park for a minute, is that because in any judgment of deaths per kilowatt hour, nuclear is about the safest of any, and all the others, particularly coal, are much higher. But because people understand those risks and sort of can box them off, they don't fear them to the same extent. Do you think that's true?
That's right, you're absolutely right again. In fact, all the psychological research shows there are three factors. One is the unknownness, the level to which the risk is unknown. The second one is how much control we've got over it. So we will tolerate a risk that we believe we've had a voluntary choice over and had control over. And some of these big industrial risks we don't. Some people don't feel they have control over. The third one is the final thing I put up. It's trust in institutions. And we don't tolerate risks if we, for whatever reason, distrust the institution that's involved. And of course, the BSE crisis in particular raised the question that the Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries and Food at that time both regulated the safety of the industry of food but also was an advocate for the farming industry, and there was a perceived conflict of interest there. And they were clearly distrusted by the end of that process, and that's why they were obviously disbanded and split up into these two different organisations ultimately. So trust is critical as well. So three factors, which if you've got all three of those, that it's a very, very tricky risk question for members of the public.